This article will go on to become the first landmark case of online violence. It is uncanny how beat by beat the unraveling of incidents align with the real life turnout of online violence. Now, if you've seen Ranjana, but at one point in the movie, the protagonist breaks into JNU. Conversation actually went into philosophical lens. People start questioning where does the body end and where does the mind begin. Before we begin, I would like to start with a trigger warning that this episode contains sexual violence, coercive control, and a lot of sexual degradation content, which is generally not very easy to hear. So I would suggest please take your time to listen to this and take care of yourself. Hi, everyone. I'm doing something different today. This is not going to be a regular explainer, but a short story on first time the world came across something called cyber rape. I'm not sure if you were paying attention, but last time I mentioned that in 1993, there was a case recorded of cyber rape. And this was the first time in the history that such case was officially recorded. Let's set the context first. This is set up in 1993. What was happening back then? European Union was just formed. Jurassic Park hit the theaters, and World Wide Web became freely accessible. So it was free for the first time. And as soon as internet was accessible, it was used for online harassment. So the story is long, and I have a memory of goldfish, so I will not even pretend like I can remember all of it, and you would see me reading out of the script. But get ready for a story where we have a clear villain, a clear victim, and still no resolution. So getting back to 1993, yes, World Wide Web is free for the first time, and Julian Dibbell, American author and tech-focused journalist, wrote an article, A Rape in Cyberspace. I will first take you through the article and the events that happened. And in the second section, I get into what were my key learnings from it. It is uncanny how beat by beat the unraveling of incidents align with the real life turnout of online violence. So let's start. Like all good stories, this one too starts on an innocuous Monday night of March of 1993. A bunch of people were online on a social media platform called LambdaMOO. LambdaMOO was an online social space. So imagine Metaverse, but highly pixelated. Let me give you a very quick background of LambdaMOO. At the time, there was this thing called multi-user dungeons. People had created an online version of Dungeons and Dragons. It would essentially be people taking on characters and moving objects based on text. So they would command go, north, or attack, and the character would do that. And what the creator of LambdaMOO, Pavel Curtis, did was that he took that format and removed all the combat and game features. So what was remaining was a social element. So it became an online place where people could take on identities from the game and interact with strangers. The space was designed based on Pavel Curtis's own California home. There was a coat closet at the entry point leading to a living room that served as the main social hub. You could essentially hang out in his online virtual space. It was this that separated LambdaMOO from the chat platforms at the time. So at that point of time, there were things like IRC or AOL, which were chatting platforms. But all of these chatting platforms were conversational. LambdaMOO was inhabitable. You had a character, a body, a presence. You could build your own rooms, you could own objects. What all of this feeling did was that it sort of built a community. People had their own social norms, and there was a sense of shared space. So going back to that story, on the fateful night, the author, Julian Dibbell, was one of the many people hanging out inside LambdaMOO. A new character entered called Mr. Bungles. Dibbell described him as open coat, an Ollie Asian-esque bisque-faced clown, so very weird, dressed in cum-stained harlequin garb, girdled with like his waist having a mistletoe and hemlock belt whose buckle bore the quaint inscription, "Kiss me under this." End quote. It was around 10 p.m. that Mr. Bungle character starts assaulting the other characters unprovoked. He got hold of something called Voodoo Doll. In LambdaMOO, a Voodoo Doll was a piece of code that let you put words and actions into another character's mouth and body. Without their consent, he started with a character called Legba. Legba was a Haitian trickster spirit character It was carefully built identity, but the gender was indeterminate from the character itself. Mr. Bungle used the doll to force Legba to sexually service him. Legba's player, the real human being on the other side of the screen, fought back with the only way they could, through words. Legba cursed him, abuses him, and eventually Mr. Bungle was physically ejected from the room. Well, that did not stop him, though. He retreated to his private chambers. Now, quick caveat, like LambdaMOO had like these spaces which were your private spaces, and then you would go to these common spaces where the incident was happening. So he was pushed back to his private space, and he retreated to it while continuing to harass people in the common room. Because the voodoo doll worked such that you didn't require proximity. The harm could be administered from anywhere. He turned next to a character called Star Singer, where he escalated his acts. He forced her into a sexual acts with others in the room, including Legba. He forced Legba to perform acts of self-degradation. He forced Star Singer to violate herself. And this whole time, his laughter could be heard across the living room. There was performance in it. Other people in the room witnessed all of it. They could not stop it, but the harassment was public until someone found Zippy, one of the administrators. He had the code that was needed to essentially cage Mr. Bungle, which would make him unreachable even by the voodoo doll. Zippy used the code, and finally, all of the incidents stopped. But by then, the damage was done. Not to the code, not to the platform, but to the people who were playing the characters of Legba and everyone who saw them being assaulted. Narrating these incidents 3 decades ago, Dibbell immediately sums up this entire incident as something that was happening in the virtual reality and not in the real world. To quote him, no hideous clowns or trickster spirits appear in the real-life version of the incident. No voodoo dolls or wizard guns. Indeed, no rape at all, as any real-life code of law has yet defined it. The actors in the drama were university students for the most part, and they sat rather undramatically before computer screens the entire time. Their only action? A spidery flitting of fingers across standard QWERTY keyboards. No bodies touched. Whatever physical interaction occurred consisted of mingling of electronic signals sent from sites spread out between New York and Sydney, Australia. End quote. All through the article, Dibbell keeps confronting this dichotomy between the real-life impact of an online assault. He reminds the readers that when all is said and done, the only thing that you really see when you visit LambdaMOO is a kind of slow crawling script, line of dialogues, and stage direction creeping steadily up your computer screen. Well, the story didn't end on that fateful night. The next day, Igba wrote a public statement to the mailing list of the group. Quote, mostly voodoo dolls are amusing, and mostly I tend to think that restrictive measures around here cause more trouble than they prevent. But I also think that Mr. Bungle was a vicious, vile, and I want his story scattered. I am not calling for policies, trials, or better jails. I'm not sure what I'm calling for. Virtual castration? If I could manage it. Mostly, this type of thing doesn't happen here. Mostly, perhaps I thought wouldn't happen to me. Mostly, I trust people to conduct themselves with some veneer of civility. Mostly, I want his Closed quote. She later told the author that when she was typing this, there were tears rolling down her eyes. Exactly like a PTSD. However, at the time, Dibbell still is debating if the punishment is too much, if her reaction is too much. His take on Legba's message was, open quote, ludicrously excessive by real life's light, woefully underrated by virtual realities. The tone of Legba's response made sense only in the buzzing, dissonant gap between them. Close quote. Legba's grievances were soon followed with the support by other members. Remember Star Singer, Zippy, who strongly criticized the events, and there was a common consensus that an organized response was required. Legba suggested toading, which is exactly as it sounds. They basically turn the character into the amphibian, the toad. But what does it mean for the platform? It essentially means that you are removed from the platform. Over the course of the next 24 hours, as many as 50 players made it known on their social platform in a variety of other forms and forums that they would be pleased to see Mr. Bungle erased from the face of LambdaMOO. But to remove a character was a little more complicated. We are familiar with that by now, aren't we? So when the platform was built, there were a few main programmers who were the custodians of the platform, but they very quickly got sick of playing the judge. So just 4 months before this incident, they had made an announcement that they've decided to step back to being just the technician, and the responsibility of making the decisions in the community was being handed over to the community members. In the 4 months, this self governing structure had, however, done very little to solve anything. So for now, they had to build a social organization and devise a formal punishment, which would mean deciding on a set of rules. As you would have guessed, they split the community across ideological lines. The legalist types argued that there was no explicit MOO rules, the MOO rules, against rape, so they could not officially take any step. They should create ones, though, and then implement them from future onwards. But retrospectively, they were against such rules being implemented on the players. Some argued that the Guardians should take back control, like they had just 4 months ago. And the most familiar voice of all were the techno-libertarians. Their argument was that the presence of on the system was a technical inevitability, best dealt not through repressive social disciplinary measures, but through the timely deployment of defensive software tools. What does that mean? It essentially means that instead of kicking them out, let's have simple features like pushing someone into a corner where they cannot use certain features. So their idea was that we can't prevent it, let's just respond. Sounds familiar to a lot of the social media platforms, doesn't it? Anyways, the debate finally had distilled down to the one we are very familiar with by now in the online space, which was censorship versus safety. And the techno-libertarian were, of course, pushing for less censorship, even if that costed some amount of safety hazards. The beauty of this debate, though, was that how each group, and again, remember, it's 1993, they have just understood the idea of this metaverse or this online world. All of the social media is yet to happen. So, in that space, the debate was how each group tried to reconcile the online actions, the real world gauge. So, is raping someone online as severe as the real world crime? Is removing them from the platform the same as pro death penalty? Even the author thought removing someone from the platform was excessive, like I just mentioned. It makes you wonder how nebulous the idea of online world was and how we have created it in our minds in the last 2 decades. So, 3 days after the incident, a meeting was held. This was the largest crowd LambdaMOO had seen gathered in one place at the time. It was also 1993, so that was 30 people, but then still the largest. To quote Dibbell, arguments multiplied and mingled. Players talked past and through each other. The textual clutter of utterances and gestures filled up the screen like thick cigar smoke. Dibbell's writing prowess really show up here. He described the room as, open quote, you could almost feel the claustrophobic air of the place, dank and overheated by virtual bodies pressing against your skin, close quote. The discussions ensued. The crowd tried to balance giving a virtual punishment for a virtual crime, but also not downplaying the seriousness of the issue. With a slight remark about it being better to release violent tendencies online than real life was immediately criticized. Even in 1993, the conversation actually went into philosophical lens. People start questioning where does the body end and where does the mind begin. But as the evening wore on, the conversation became more circular, and even the arguments that looked like they were heading in some decisive direction ended up going in circles. The highlight was that at one point, the Mr. Bungle shows up. And guess what people asked him? Their first question was, why did you do it? He genuinely responded. His response, open quote, I engaged in a bit of a psychological device that is called thought polarization. The fact that this is not real life simply added to the heightened effect of the device. It was purely a sequence of events with no consequence on my real life existence. Close quote. Post that, the conversation just then fizzled out. People started drifting away, meetings died out without any meaningful conclusions. One of the master programmers heard the meeting through the sidelines. The master programmers here, and I think it's about time I tell you that they call their master programmers, of course, wizards. So wizards had these ability to access the fundamental code. They could do things the regular players could not. Think of them as admins in our current day and age. So one of the wizards heard the meetings from the sideline and realized that the only solution was that either he acts alone or not act at all. So, guess what did he do? He acted alone. He removed Mr. Bungles from the platform. And that marked the end of the Mr. Bungles saga. Well, almost. There is a small caveat at the end, but I'll get to it quickly. The final move by the platform at the end of all of this was to change the policy again. And this time, they set up a voting system, whereby the wizards had to do what the majority wanted. It led to decisions like everyone having access to boot, which is being able to throw people away. Few days later, the Mr. Bungles character showed up again as a new avatar. But by then, the amazement had died and the news cycle had moved on. Mr. Bungle's character had also, grown up and didn't do anything crazy. And so the world just moved on. Months later, when the author was looking for the character, they realized that although the new avatar of Mr. Bungle was still around, it wasn't active. And there ended the tale, cited as the first recorded case of online violence, because it was the first time a non-consensual act of sexual aggression took place in a digital space. All through the article, if no one else, the one person who did change their opinion was the author himself, Dibbell. To quote him, "Where before I had found it hard to take virtual rape seriously, I now was finding it difficult to remember how I could ever not have taken it seriously." End quote. There ends the story. And now on to my learnings of it. Welcome to the section 2. I have a lot of thoughts about the story. It had a good beginning, a very concrete middle, and not so much of an end. My favorite bit was everyone trying to come up with an outcome. I don't know if you've seen Ranjana, but at one point in the movie, the protagonist breaks into JNU. One of the students finds him, catches him, makes him sit on a side, and a bunch of other students gather in. And now the protagonist is scared because he's like, oh, I've been caught breaking in. But instead of punishing him, the people start debating his situation, debating whether punishing is their right, debating whether he was doing it out of his need. And the beauty of that scene is that all of the night is spent in doing that. The protagonist at that point of time in the morning calls for chai for everyone. Everyone has a cup of tea. The rest of them continue debating, and the protagonist just leaves. So this felt like that. I think Mr. Beagles entered. He did a lot of crime. And then he became irrelevant. People got into their psychological segues and tried to create structures and norms, leaving him unpunished. But those were not my learnings. My learnings are in 3 bullet points. 1, the violation was similar to the real world violation. Second, there's the tension between censorship and safety. And the third, the failure of collective action. Let me get into each of those. My first learning is that the violation was very similar to the real world. Describing what happened to Legba, Dibbell says, open quote, "She suffered a brand of degradation, all too customarily reserved for the embodied female," close quote. Dibbell is essentially capturing the idea that I came across too, which was the fact that the sexualization of women and the coercive control is very familiar ground in the offline world. And to see that play out on an online space in the year World Wide Web becomes accessible is not just harrowing, it's actually a learning movement. It makes it clear how foundational the idea of gender-based violence is to the formation of internet. And did you notice how similar the actions were? How the idea of sexual coercion was to show power, how the person who did it laughed through all of it, and then when asked why did they do it, said that they thought they'll get out of it scot-free. So all of this reeks a lot of the offline violence. And it is foundational to know that in 1993, when the first brick of the internet was being put, we already had this idea of online violence essentially just facilitating the offline violence. I think if I had to sum up this learning, I would say that what happened in LambdaMOO that night was not just a random event. It was not a one-off event. It was a male character who used a tool that gave him control over female and gender non-conforming bodies to reestablish the power structure that were very common in the offline world. And We need to sit and reconcile with this idea that the nature of the online violence and the offline violence are similar and they come from the same roots. The second insight, which really got to me, was the fact that the tension between censorship and safety is so foundational to the idea of internet. The awkwardness in the group to clearly define the problem did not just stem from not knowing internet back then, but from this core issue that punishing people or preventing online violence inherently is at crossroads with the idea of freedom and individuality. People seek internet to find a safe haven where they can be themselves without the constant judgment that the real world provides. They want these identities to be separate from the real world. So when we expect these structures to come under the microscope of social norms or community guidelines or government coming up with rules, they essentially put that idea of freedom under threat. Very recent example of it is that European Union has asked all the social media platforms to figure out a way to get the identification for each individual so they can be sure that all the children are classified as under 18 and have certain security measures imposed. What that means is that everyone would have to then present their social identification. You could earlier create anonymous accounts and be whoever you wanted to be under various names. You could use the anonymity to save you from censorship rules, from hard governmental pressures. So this idea that now you have to have your identity revealed is actually not a very easy conversation. But on the other hand, we have to understand that the safety of children, the safety of women, the safety of minorities lies in knowing who the perpetrator is. A large part of the safety relies on knowing who did it and punishing them. And there being some repercussion, there being some cost of the things that happen online. And so we have to confront this issue. We have to come to it from a point of view where we are not letting either sides of the party be the victim. And we have solved these issues earlier. We have done this before through legal means, through years of deliberation and very conscious control. And that brings me to the third point. My next insight was to see how the collective action failed. In economics, we are taught this concept called collective action problem, which essentially is people choosing the suboptimal outcome rather than the best one because they choose their self-interest over what is good for the public. For instance, the traffic jams in India. It is a collective action problem because if everyone works synchronously and gives up on their innate need to overtake for a minute and let the other person go, we would all move very smoothly, right? But we optimize for our individual interest. We think if we overtake, we would reach home early without thinking of what would happen to the general public. And something like that happened in this incident too, if you noticed. When Legba raises up the issue and says, this is wrong, it should not happen, everyone does agree with her. People agree to the fact that what happened was not acceptable. And after that, instead of being clear-headed and focusing on solving that problem and punishing the person specifically, people get into their personal ideas, their personal agendas, their personal ideological opinions, with the final outcome being that the Mr. Bungles, well, at best gets thrown out once, but doesn't really face any real repercussion. And they also don't even come up with a clear strategy for this happening the next time. Nothing happens in that meeting because people just do not work together to come up with a common solution. They come together to put on their opinion and to, well, in a certain way, virtue signal. Or if I give them benefit of doubt, to create structures that would have made sense. But all of this to say that things fizzle out because there is no common foundation. And this common foundation, in most cases, is provided by law. The law of a land is essentially people around coming together to solve for this very problem. Them saying that, okay, the society will incur certain cost to provide certain freedoms to the individuals. And therefore, we give up our right to violence because we want to be safe. And we don't want to live in a world where the most violent person then wins. The point then being that where we are right now and where the world was in 1993 is a very similar spot. While everyone acknowledges that there is a problem and people are coming to terms that there might be something that is dreadful and completely unacceptable about this format of violence, there is no common groundwork in the legal structures for it. There are situations where you would hear people saying, oh, but this is very difficult to legalize. And it's not. Laura Bates, in her book, The New Age of Sexism, very clearly states that we wouldn't have these concerns with food regulation, do we? We don't go around saying, oh, it's very difficult to regulate food because we can't keep a lookout on everything. We also don't accept that, oh, if the food is traveling from country A to country B, there is no way for us to measure it. We have very strict standards for the sort of food we put in our body. And therefore, we ensure that the world functions such that the quality is maintained. It is the same level of rigor and intent that we need to bring to the online violence if we want to see any change. And while I still don't have an answer for the censorship versus safety question, or what is it that is stopping the legal world from coming up with clear frameworks, I do think this incident really does capture the very core of the problem we are all sitting with. I think Mr. Bungles was not an exception. He was a person who had power and saw what internet would turn out to be in the next 2 decades. Before I conclude, I do want to leave you on a note that European Union is trying to solve this problem to an extent by coming up with something called the Digital Services Act. They are trying to regulate the platforms, search engines to ensure that there is some level of quality control and the idea of online violence is limited. We're yet to see how it plays out. We're also yet to see how the social media platforms would fight against or solve for the problem of identification to eventually make these online spaces safe for children. It's a lot of open questions and we don't have the answers. But as we go on in this journey, I hope we will come up with some sort of understanding, some sort of nuance to this conversation. Well, see you in the next video and let me know what you think of it. Let me know what your insights from this were. And I will come back with some concept in 2 weeks. See you again. Also, do whatever is done. I mean, subscribe, follow, comment, etc., etc. I don't know. I will learn this someday, but today's not that day. Have a good day. Bye.